When there's a great loss, a spouse, a child, a very dear friend, we simply pretend it didn't happen for a time. It allows us to assimilate the loss into our lives without simply being knocked completely off our feet. So denial is first, but then after denial, often we become very angry. And anger is always an emotion that piggybacks on some other emotion, and there's a lot going on in grief. So the anger can be intense, and it can be focused. It can produce feelings of guilt, so then we get angry at ourselves for feeling guilty. I mean, anger can be all over the place. But anger will then often give way to the stage that Kubler-Ross says is bargaining. You don't have to show a raise of hands, but how many of you, in experiencing a loss that really threw you into the process of grief, went through that stage where you tried to just make a deal with God? Just give me one more chance, just bring him or her back one final time, and and then we have this long list of things. But the bargaining always asks for God to simply reverse the loss we experience. But soon it will become evident that the bargaining isn't working. There's no deal to be cut, and the loss is real, and someone who was an important part of your life for so long is now gone. And the emptiness leads to a depression, a loss of energy, a loss of hope, a loss of idealism. Sometimes you simply can't function. Now, this is not a clinical depression that someone might live with, that thing caused by some out of balance brain chemistry. This is the normal experience of hopelessness that is part of our human experience in grief. And Kubler-Ross and the other researchers say then finally, there just comes a time when life returns to what has sometimes been called its new normal. We know that it will go on. Life must go on. There are other people in my life I have to attend to. There's other things I can do. And so we accept the loss. I mentioned these 5 stages to also point out that they are often misunderstood. It is not a process that we can predict. I'm in denial, I'm angry, I bargain, I'm depressed. Oh, I'm okay now, I'm accepting. Not everyone goes through all 5 of those stages. Some people have longer time spent in one than the other. Also, the stages aren't linear. It's not like you get a little card and you check them off. Been depressed, I'm in through stage 3. Oh, now I'm accepting, I've made it, I'm home free. Grief, and if you've lost someone, you know this is true. Grief is a process that cycles. We go through, we come back again and again, experience something over and over. My grandfather died of a pulmonary embolism, left home to go to town to do some shopping, and she got a call that he had dropped dead on a sidewalk outside of a store. There was no hope, and it was an intense, immediate loss, and so the grief was real. That happened when I was in high school, and when I was in college back visiting my grandmother, and she and I were talking. It was late in the afternoon, and about 5:30 came, and she said, you know, this time of day, I hear the outer door open and close, and I smell his pipe. I smell his pipe. You know, she was still grieving. I don't share that to say anything about my grandmother's experience, but to say this is intensely human. And when we lose someone, we never get over their loss. We can move beyond it. Now, I want to point out that this is a human experience, and you don't have to be a Christian to get to acceptance. You can be a person of any faith or no faith. And if you lose, this is the way human beings have evolved to deal with this loss. So I don't want to really focus on the stages of grief in any kind of a therapeutic conversation. I want to ask the question, is there anything different for us as a people of faith? Is there anything that our faith brings to this experience of loss that is unique and strengthening for us? Charles Wesley, one of the brothers who founded the tradition we now call Methodists, was once asked by someone who was a bit suspicious of this kind of church renewal program going on, was asked if his Methodists lived better than other people. And Wesley purportedly answered, no, they don't, but they die better. And what he was saying is that a living faith makes a difference in the way we deal with those experiences of loss, even if it's our own death. It makes a difference. In the Lamentation, the book of Lamentation, again, because everything has been lost. This is an experience of a nation being conquered, and the experience of being conquered is brutal. Not only have the walls of the city been destroyed and the temple razed and the palaces torn down and the leadership marched off or executed, but the young men who served in the army lie dead in the street. Children and the elderly, so vulnerable, have starved to death. Disease is rampant out of siege warfare. And the author of Lamentations speaks of seeing family desecrated, lives destroyed, hope left in ruins. And as he pours out his heart and his lament for such tragedy, he writes, I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss. Yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. Jesus also patterns his experience of grief in a similar way. On the cross, having been betrayed by his own close circle, having been deserted by those who should have stood up for him, having been forced into a kangaroo court subject to a sentence to death, having been scourged, and finally, alone on the cross, isolated, dying all by himself, he cries out, my God, why have you abandoned me? And in that cry is the cry of everyone who experiences loss in our life. The normal we want to exist has been replaced by a situation we prayed would never happen. Why have you abandoned me, God? Why have you left me alone? Why have you not fulfilled the promises I thought we were holding together? Why are we now living with such emptiness? We need to understand that that cry from Jesus was a real cry. But so was the other cry he made from that cross when he said, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. He didn't quickly, in those few hours that the Romans had him impaled on their execution gallows, he didn't quickly move through the 5 stages of grief and arrive at acceptance. He simply calls upon the faithfulness of God and place his trust there, knowing that his suffering and his pain is not the last word. I chose to pair this lesson with that account from Matthew 8, the stilling of the storm. The Sea of Galilee has a lot in common with Lake Erie, inasmuch as it's a place that can very quickly go from calm to violent waters. And apparently this storm that threatened the disciples in the boat was one of those quick gales that came up. The boat was being swamped, they're terribly frightened, and Jesus, for some inexplicable understanding, who can understand this? He's sleeping through the crisis. And they go to wake him up, probably to say, if we're going to be afraid, you might as well be afraid with us. Lord, how can you sleep? We're all going to die. And Jesus says to them, "Oh, you of little faith, why are you afraid?" Now, I have always heard that as a call to the faith they should have had, and the faith that, even if it was tiny, should have enabled them to calm the seas and stop the wind from blowing and let Jesus sleep. He obviously needed his rest. I remember that being told in sermons I heard as a youth, and that interpretive track has always stayed with me until lately when I was looking at it, I realized that's not what Jesus is saying at all. If that's what he's saying, then somewhere in the last 2,000 years, we would have figured out that it just takes that much faith, and we would have exercised a lot of control over the weather. And think of the disaster that would be. If we've made a mess of things with climate change, which we're going to look at on July 12th, think how much of a mess that we would have made of things if we could, with a word, change the weather. Never would be a golf outing postponed. No baseball games rained out. Or perhaps in the fourth and a 12-1 loss, we could have rained them out. If we had more faith in the guys on the other side. No picnics canceled, no fireworks displays postponed. And probably, if we had the faith so to control the weather at our whim, no rain to water the crops, and no way to dissipate the energy in the atmosphere, truly we would have made a mess of things. We think faith means we get to have the normal we imagine. All right, truth-telling time. I want to see hands. How many of you in the last week have complained about the rain? If you didn't, are you sleeping? How many do you think in the Central Valley of California in the last week have complained about the lack of rain? What does it mean when here we're getting flooded? How many of you have had your basement flooded? Yeah, a few hands there. Mine is up. What does it mean when we experience that and another place they have no rain? Where is God in all of this? What Jesus was challenging the disciples with in that boat when he said, "You of little faith, why are you afraid?" He wasn't chastising them for not believing they could control the weather with even a mustard seed size of faith. He was saying, don't you remember? Don't you trust? The love of God never fails. In the midst of crisis, in the midst of pain, in the midst of trial, the love of God does not fail you. It continues. If the waves are threatening your boat, God's love is not stopped. If your life is suddenly wrenched apart because of a loved one's passing, the love of God does not stop. If you've lost your job or your dreams have been dashed, The love of God continues even through that. Jesus says, where is your trust? Trust in God. Life is dynamic. Grief is normal. Loss is a part of living. But the love of God is stronger yet. The events in Charleston invite us to grab hold of that trust. Bishop Eaton calls us to a new conversation about race. And here is a truth. I believe this is truth. Racism and its effects in our society will never be addressed until we, white folks, do the addressing. You don't have to convince people of color that racism is real. They live with it every day. They do not hold the key to a change and a transformation of our society. We hold that key. We, who because of our race, benefit from the structures that keep one group down and gives us more of a chance. We are the ones who need to listen, who need to be in conversation, both with people of color, but perhaps more importantly, with ourselves, and who need to challenge the wrong ideas perpetuated by the white supremacist system that drove one of our fellow church members to allegedly commit this heinous act. The secret is in us. And if that's true, then perhaps if you're willing to take a moment to be honest and think about it, you say, but what can we do? Systemic issues are so deeply impacted. How can I make a difference? If I speak up when a group of friends makes a racist comment or tell a joke and I say, that's not funny, what difference will that make? They'll just quit telling the jokes around me. Trust me, I know this is true. I'm a pastor. There's a lot of people who start to tell a joke and then realize who's in the room and decide they should go another way. But that doesn't stop them from telling the joke when I'm not there. So we say, what difference will it make? This is where we put our trust in God, who says, I will still dare to hope when I remember this, the faithful love of the Lord never ends. Never. And what we do as God's people makes a difference, because the Spirit can amplify and magnify our actions and change hearts, and that's what it takes. This is a day to mourn. It is also a day to hope. This is a time to grieve, but not to grieve without trust in the love of God. This is a time to not only question why, but to allow our faith to embrace that why with the word of hope. And our hope is in this: the faithful love of the Lord never ends. Amen.